Heading into the 2013 season, I said that the Pittsburgh Steelers were going to be bad. And early on in the season, they made me look like a genius. With their 0-4 start, the Steelers were looking like they were going to get a top 5 pick in the draft. They were going to win 4, maybe 5 games. They looked terrible. Their defense was getting shredded. Their offense couldn't get a rhythm. They lacked a running game. Big Ben didn't look great. It was just a lot of things were not looking good for the Steelers early on in the season. To their credit, they found a way to rebound, respond. They didn't give up. They didn't quit. And they made a season out of it. Mike Tomlin, his coaching staff, the players, they deserve a lot of credit because once you start 0-4, it's an incredibly difficult road to hoe to try and get back into the playoffs. But they did, and they got back into the playoff race by going 8-4 the rest of the way. Now, ultimately, they ended up missing the playoffs. But really, even though I'm sure Steelers fans and Steelers players and the Steelers organization feel screwed because of what happened in the Kansas City-San Diego game the last week of the year, the fact of the matter is, the bottom line is that the Steelers shouldn't have left it to chance where that was even a possibility. They're even fortunate or lucky to have been in the playoff race come week 17 because other teams around them were starting to screw the pooch, like Miami and Baltimore. That's the whole reason they were in the playoff race to begin with, was because those teams were starting to screw the pooch. Well, nobody screwed the pooch more for their own chances in 2013, perhaps, than the Pittsburgh Steelers. And here's what I mean. In the 2012 season, I talked about the losses to teams like the Oakland Raiders and etc. and said those are not losses that playoff teams can have. That's why the Steelers are a mediocre team. That's why the Steelers missed the playoffs last year. Well, that's why the Steelers missed the playoffs again this year. They lost to Oakland and Tennessee and Minnesota and Chicago and Baltimore and Miami. Those are 6 teams out of your 8 losses. 6 of your 8 losses were to teams that had records of 8-8 or below, including a team in the Oakland Raiders who has the 5th overall pick in the draft, the Minnesota Vikings who had the 8th overall pick in the draft, and the Tennessee Titans who had the 11th overall pick in the draft. You lost to some bad football teams. So as much as a lot of Steeler Nation wants to sit there and focus on what happened in the Kansas City-San Diego game in the non-call and the field goal in Week 17, maybe if you would have beaten Oakland's sorry ass and Minnesota's sorry ass, you'd have made the playoffs. Because that would have gotten you to 10 wins, right? And the last week of the season, as long as you beat Cleveland, it wouldn't have mattered. You'd have been in. Ultimately, when you fail to take care of your own business and you leave it for something else to chance, you have nobody ultimately to blame but yourself. And that's exactly the way I summarize the Steelers season in 2013, period. You can make all the excuses you want. But when you can't handle your business, in particular against the bad teams, they lost to the Raiders again. How the hell can they not figure out a way to beat the Raiders? It's disgraceful and embarrassing for a Steelers organization that's won how many Super Bowls? 6? Wow. They've been to 8. They're 6-2 in the Super Bowl. They've been to 8 Super Bowls. And they can't find a way to beat that talentless Raiders team again? Holy shit. Now, there were some positives for the season. Big Ben had a solid year. Whereas early on in the year, I thought he was looking a little sluggish and a little questionable. He ended up throwing for 4,200 passing yards and 28 touchdowns. Had a good solid season. Le'Veon Bell, the second-round pick out of Michigan State, I feel established himself as a future feature 3-down running back. You don't get a lot of feature 3-down running backs in the NFL. And Le'Veon Bell established himself as a physical, hard-nosed, between-the-tackles runner who has some life and giddy-up in his legs, who can also be a weapon in the passing game out of the backfield. Antonio Brown had like 1,499 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns. He established himself as Big Ben's go-to target in the passing game. There were some definite positives there. But then you look at the defensive side of the football. 4 of their top 5 tacklers were in the secondary. That's an indication of problems, especially when that secondary is very old. Look, the bottom line is you're going to hear a lot of talk about the Pittsburgh Steelers and their offseason philosophy. You're going to see a lot of mock drafts that maybe have them going after a wide receiver in the first round, somebody like a Marquise Lee or a Mike Evans. And I understand that, and I get that. But it's the wrong approach. I also understand the emphasis and the focus on the Steelers' offensive line still needing help and still needing work after a lot of years of investing a lot of high picks into that position. And I understand that, and I get that. And that's also wrong. The bottom line is the Steelers' identity since the 70s, really, has been defense. That's the identity. And that's the identity that they've won with consistently. This is not something like where you're saying, oh, it's Bears football, where Bears football has primarily been losing football. What type of identity is that? the Steelers have consistently won playing Steeler football, running the ball, vertical passing game, and tough physical defense that forces a lot of pressure on opposing quarterbacks and makes big plays when they need to. That's the Steelers' identity. And they didn't have that identity this year. Their defense in games played well, and other games played terrible. Other games just played middle of the road. And part of the reason is because this defensive unit has gotten old in a big hurry. And they haven't done a very good job of replacing old stars with new young stars. Yeah, sure, they brought in the Lawrence Timmonses, and they've brought in the past guys like Lamar Woodleys, and they drafted Jarvis Jones in the first round this past year. But Cameron Hayward hasn't exactly been a stud. Ziggy Hood sure as hell wasn't a stud. They never really effectively, I feel, brought in an in-house replacement for somebody along the lines of a Casey Hampton, which is critical when you're running a 3-4 defense to have that nose tackle that could be a space heater that eat up 2 or 3 blockers at a time. But the biggest flaw and the biggest problem I see with the Steelers' defense, and it has been for a number of years, is their secondary. 3 of their 4 starters are 30 and older. And the 4th starter, William Gay, is 29. There are no spring chickens back there. Polamalu's like 32, Ike Taylor's like 33, 34, and Ike Taylor and Ryan Clark, is 34. They're getting old. And they're old in the back half of that defense. They're old in that secondary. And the last time that the Steelers took a defensive back in the first round was 2003 with Troy Polamalu. That worked out very, very well for them. The last time they took a corner in the first round of the draft was 1997, and that was Chad Scott. That's a lot of years of basically flat out ignoring that position with high picks in the NFL draft. It is high time for the Steelers in 2014, in this offseason, in the draft, to address youth, talent, and depth in that secondary. They need it in bunches. They need to be focusing on a corner or safety in round 1. They need to be focusing again on a corner or safety in round 2. And then maybe come round 4 or 5, draft yet another one. In my opinion, the Steelers should invest at least 4, if not 5 draft picks total into their secondary and their defensive unit as a whole in this upcoming draft. I understand the focus and the attention on the offensive line. I understand and get the attention to wide receiver, maybe tight end as well. But the bottom line is, and the fact of the matter remains, is the Steelers' identity is ultimately on the defensive side of the football. And that defense only gets older by the day. The Steelers do have talent in place. And with that infrastructure and with that coaching staff, they are never that far away from being a contending team. But if they go another offseason without addressing that secondary, and they get another year older, that defense is going to be even worse next year, and you're going to be looking at the Steelers losing to even more bad teams as they win only 5 or 6 games, and you can book it.